Today, we're going to be doing something completely different. I'm not starting a podcast, but it's sort of a podcast. And it's going to be called What Needs to Change? That's the question I'm going to ask every single guest, no matter who they are, and they can answer it however they want to. The guest we have today is Dr. Alex Lascu. She is a doctor in skill acquisition, something that's so important these days that isn't really highlighted to very many coaches. We're going to be talking about what she thinks needs to change and how we can get there. If you want to learn more about the work that Dr. Alex does, check my description for her podcast, The Deep End, and her newsletter. I hope you enjoy it. It's something new, and I learnt a lot, so I hope you do as well. Let's get into it.
Whoa.
That's the harshest way I could say it.
I was like, how dare you get to a point where you have to grab a 6-year-old's arm and shove it into the air? If winning is important, what else can we win?
Say it one more time for the people in the back.
What else can we win?
Oh, hey, Alex.
Hi.
All right. Hey, guys. Welcome to the podcast. This podcast is called What Needs to Change? We're here with Dr. Alex Lascu. She's a doctor in skill acquisition. And Alex, could you introduce yourself just for everybody else's information?
Yeah, I guess you've covered off the most part in that the reason I'm often on these podcasts is because I did a PhD in skill acquisition. I often introduce myself as an amateur as well. So the root of the word amateur comes from like lover of. And so I pretty much just love learning in sport. And that's where I spend the majority of my time at the moment. So anything from athletes learning new skills to coaches becoming better at what they do, that's probably where I spend the most of my time.
Now, I start off every single one of these podcasts with the same question. It's super open-ended. And that question is, what needs to change?
Where do we start? I think that's the trick with an open question like that. There are so many things that we could change, but I like what needs to change because I think there's probably a domino that needs to fall first that would have the biggest amount of change as a result. So that flow-on effect has been something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like, is there a moment, especially as coaches? So I often think of it as if coaching is such a person-centered thing, if we have to take care of the people in front of us, what do we need to change about coaches and coaching? And I think the lack of self-awareness and where our assumptions come from is probably that domino that I think needs to fall first.
Gotcha. So you're saying that the awareness of coaches or the awareness of players as well?
I think self-awareness of coaches more so than the self-awareness. I think like athletes in most circumstances almost have too much self-awareness, or at least put too much pressure on that self-awareness. But when you ask a coach why they do something or where does this come from or what is this based on, how do people learn, most coaches don't have an answer to that question.
Gotcha.
And that's kind of terrifying given they're responsible for all of those things.
And when you ask that question, like, I guess, do people just say, oh, I don't really know? Or do they try and like sort of bulldoze you with facts and say, oh, this is why I'm doing it. How dare you ask me, sort of thing?
It definitely comes down to how you ask the question.
Yeah.
I'd like to think I've gotten pretty good at sounding curious, like genuinely curious. Because a why question can be so confronting when delivered poorly. And so I would like to think that when I ask why, it's only because I've kind of worn them down to the point where they definitely are willing to talk about it. I try to avoid a question like that as much as possible, or I try to sound like a toddler, almost like, why? But when that doesn't work, I think we have to go back to, okay, I quite like the where does this come from? Because if we're dealing with the kind of coaches who just recreate the drills that worked for them, which I'm not saying are inherently bad, then we can kind of see, okay, well, is this something that you've created specifically for this moment? Is this something that you've adapted from someone else? Is this something that you have just deployed because you have no idea what to do next? I kind of need to know that before I can continue the conversation with someone. And most people will be like, I don't know. Like that's such a common response to a lot of the questions that we ask. I just don't know where this comes from, or why it was done on me as an athlete and now I coach it. I kind of just, in this moment, is what I'm expected to do. This is the drill that we do for this particular skill. Okay, well, or why is that? Oh, just because it does it.
Yeah. So I guess like I've been in the same boat as you. Like I've been coaching coaches for a few years now, and my biggest hurdle is, I guess, getting these players to understand, like you said, where this information comes from. I think that's a really great question, because it's not sort of blaming or shaming. It's sort of just like, where do you get this info from? Really interested. But I think the main question is just like, oh, well, my coach did it. And I think my biggest hurdle is sort of in a very harsh way of saying, like, there's a reason why your coach doesn't have any elite athletes, sort of thing. It's just like, because their drills sucked.
Whoa.
Like, that's the harshest way I could say it. But it's like, when they're doing like a drill that is just completely a waste of all the kids' time, there's like 15 kids in a line and there's one kid with the coach's attention, and then I'm like, oh, where'd this come from? And they're like, oh yeah, my coach taught it to me. I'm like, true. How do you tell coaches that, man, this drill isn't that good? It's just not good.
I've kind of toyed with the idea of like collecting data on that particular idea, because sometimes it's like subjectively it's really hard to be like, well, this person's not paying attention. They're like, oh yeah, they are. They're just like, transitioning from the different positions. And you're like, oh yeah, it's like, so for a great example, I recently saw an activity where people had to just set to someone who was standing at the other side of the court just to, practice that distance, and they would rotate through. So we had 20 people walking around, throwing the ball to a setter. The setter would set the ball. The person would catch that ball and walk around the line.
Totally.
And I actually counted. I counted how many times an individual person touched the ball in a minute, and it was twice.
Gotcha. I see.
I feel like those kind of stats, like when you show that to somebody, like I could definitely draw their attention as a coach to the fact that so many people are not actively engaged in the activity, but they can kind of explain that away. But the second you say, like, this particular person has touched the ball twice in 60 seconds, and you're telling me that time on task is important, at what point do we need to readjust what you think is important or how you're achieving it? Uh-huh. And like, that's a very delicate conversation. I'm so guilty of going in way too hard, because to me it's super obvious. And like, I'm like, how can you not see that this is exactly what's happening? I can read body language from a kilometer away in terms of if kids are bored or being over-challenged, overwhelmed, like, because I've always needed to be so attuned to those things and to be able to regulate myself in those moments where, I definitely am overstimulated and can't really like do anything about it. And so I find it so frustrating when people can't see what's happening in front of them because they're too busy enacting a plan that's happening in their head, but not in real life.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's almost getting people out of their head again and be like, okay, well, what is happening to the people in front of you right now? And how do we make sure that those are the people that are getting the benefits from this training session, not your ego?
So I guess my next question is, we've learned how to measure like what is bad. So low reps, 2 touches a minute. How can we start to like push encouragement on being like, hey, like, is it just, hey, every kid touched the ball in the last minute or something? Like, how do you encourage positive drills and positive activities for coaches?
I think it comes back to the intention of the activity in the first place. And so I can't actually recommend a different way forward unless I know what the point of the activity is. And usually that's maybe for the first time. So if I ask someone the intention of an activity and they can't tell me, then the next step from that conversation is, okay, well, what do you want them to be able to do after the activity that they maybe couldn't do before? And that's a great way to set an intention for that particular space. And then from there, it's like, okay, well, how do you know what success looks like? Or how many times do you have to experience that moment before you think you can actually get better at it? Because twice in a minute is probably not going to be enough for me to learn anything at all in any context. So how many times do you think it would take? If maybe not in a minute, but I would want them to be engaged, like maybe 10 times every 5 minutes, especially if it's something quite challenging and they need almost like a recovery to come back to and learn from the next moment. Okay, perfect. So can we pick one person and just measure how many times they do it as a sample of, what's happening? And then we can ask them whether or not they need more or less time to explore that moment. And then we can readjust from there. But I'll never do anything really in isolation from what the athletes are doing, even though it's largely coach development, because I think it's really hard to separate those two things. And our success measures should be whether or not an athlete feels as though they can do that thing, solve that problem, tackle something they've never done before. That's ultimately what we're trying to do as coaches. So our coach development outcomes need to be connected to that too.
Do you think that the coaching development is sort of moving towards teaching and like creating lesson plans with a learning intention and what are we learning today? And this is what I'm looking for, sort of thing.
Yeah, what was it? Walt Wilton tips?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yep, nice.
Thank you. I do not have a teaching degree. I just really love PE. And I spent way too much time in the PE staff room when I was bored as a kid. I actually think we already do that within our session planning as coaches. So anyone who kind of uses a more modern approach to coaching hopefully considers these ideas a bit more. But I actually think we're getting to a point now where outcomes, like desired outcomes, are futile. And I haven't set particular outcomes. I can set intentions, but not outcomes, because I cannot determine what someone learns from a particular moment. And me trying to force that learning upon someone is probably going to do more harm than good, even if my intentions are really strong and like really positive. And so I try to be like, here are the opportunities for learning. Here are the moments that you can explore. But I've kind of moved away from learning outcomes because there's absolutely no guarantee that someone will respond in a particular way. And I think removing the outcomes then allows you the leeway of, okay, well, if it didn't happen today, there's no guarantee that it might not dawn on them later with the next exposure or the next time they find themselves in that moment. They're like, oh, I've been here before. I could do this. And they might not notice that until after they try it in a highly competitive environment and surprise you. And so I think letting go of what we think the outcomes are going to be or what we expect them to be completely changes the way we design a session, because I'm not actually looking for whether or not you can do it right now. I want you to be able to do it some of the time, because it'll be incredibly frustrating if you cannot solve this problem at all.
Yep.
And that kind of speaks to a challenge point, like how challenging does this need to be? But I'm also not concerned if you can't do it straight away, because I want you to just get closer to the thing we're trying rather than further away.
Okay.
And we don't know how long it's going to take until you actually nail it.
So when you said desired outcomes are futile, I think a lot of coaches say, okay, we need to do this until you succeed 10 times. Is that what you're sort of saying? Like having that expectation is futile, or are you saying something else?
I'm saying like if my desired outcome is to be able to do this thing for the first time, I'm not going to see that as something that you have to be able to perform. Mm-hmm. So especially if it's a new skill or something that you probably haven't been asked to do so before, I'm not expecting them to be able to do it 10 times in a row.
Gotcha.
And that's personally because that doesn't seem like learning to me. That seems like performing. And if I really want someone to try something that they couldn't do before, chances are in the first session they shouldn't be able to do it 10 times in a row.
Yep.
Maybe as a team they can do it 10 times in a row because everyone can contribute once or twice. Mm-hmm. And that's a nice goal. But there is a big difference between expecting someone to do it 10 times and a team to do it 10 times.
I see. So I guess, are you saying, just clarifying, that coaches aren't there to teach, they're there to give opportunities to learn? Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Gotcha.
that's a really good way of putting it.
Okay. Interesting. Now,
So a quote that I use to kind of back that up and support it is that a gardener can't grow tomatoes. They can only foster an environment in which they do.
nice.
And so that is the kind of, that for me, that is the crux of coaching. That is where we delineate from teaching. We don't actually have control over a lot of the things that we would want to control to create solid learning environments. So we need to make the most of those environments so that people thrive in them when we do have them.
Gotcha. I like that. Educators are gardeners. Hell yeah.
Sports scientists are considered sport ecology designers. Like we're designing the ecology around the person rather than the training design.
Interesting. Okay. What type of soil are we using? What type of fertilizer? Interesting questions. How much water we do? What to do? What to do?
Do we need direct sunlight or not?
Yeah, man. Oof. I've killed a few plants in my life. So.
Oh, yeah. I did say it's ironic. I was like, please don't say that because I'm terrible with actual plants. And does that mean I'm terrible with people too?
If people were cacti, I'd be a freaking great coach. Those things never die.
I have killed cacti. My dad has revived it, like literally brought it back from the brink of death, and it's still alive. And I thought it was absolutely done. It still lives in our garden, like
Hell yeah.
15 years later.
Hell yeah. Be a cactus, guys. Be a cactus. No matter what type of gardener you have. All right. I'm going to ask another question that's sort of connected to the ones we've been talking about with awareness. And I guess you said the first step is awareness, but from the domino effect of becoming aware and starting to change your practices as a coach, how can you trust the research? Because in my experiences, like I've done all this research, I'm like, hell yeah, this is awesome. But then like how many world champions have I won? 0. How many how many even like state competitions have I won? 0. And like I'm blindly trusting the research here because I think that's a good idea. But how do we stay strong and actually trust the research instead of being like, oh, actually, I'm going to go back to my old ways because I actually won something back then? You know, like if they came from success and now they've tried these new things and kids hate it, they're like, oh, why is this so different? And then everybody else hates it. So that's my question. How do we get to a point where we can just trust it?
I think it's not necessarily about trusting it blindly, but like layering it into what we do. So one of the biggest issues we have when we try something new is that we can't get past the fact that it's uncomfortable to begin with. And so I've always really loved the design principle, like most advanced yet acceptable. I think Ross Pinder was one of the first people to kind of apply this to the sporting world. But I think we probably go in too hard with the different and the new, and that discomfort takes away from the fact that if we actually just made it 1% better, 10% better, or even just like 1% different, we would probably have a similar outcome, or at least it would definitely be better than it was before. And it depends on what you need to be better. So I think the championships question is always an interesting one, because I'm quite cynical, especially about talent pathways. And I don't really see the point of winning championships because like we place so much emphasis on success. It makes it really hard to genuinely follow that, because usually the people you coach from other places or other people have been reinforced that this is important. And so you can't just be like, oh, cool, it doesn't matter. Well, it matters to them. So I can't just take that away as much as I would love to. We're not at that point yet, I think, in our sporting journeys where we can get rid of the need for winning. But I really love the idea of, if winning is important, what else can we win? And so it's not just about the entire championship.
Say that one more time.
Or the game. I bet you do.
Say
and it doesn't surprise me in the
say it one
slightest.
more time, Alex. Say it one more time for the people in the back.
What else can we win? And so I think of it as how many moments can we win? And that moment becomes a win because we've defined what that win looks like, not an arbitrary score or luck or a competition phase. And I've heard some amazing stories, and this is something I would love to see in cricket more of, because it's such a sport that is heavily based on interactions with other people. Is that what if you just had an entire championship that was completely not based on the score on the weekend? So every movement you make, every functional behavior that you do, could you actually make that the championship? And I see it, this is probably one of my more radical ideas that I've had in my new job, but what if we made a training championship where every run that you score at training counts towards the leaderboard, but the runs that you score on the weekend don't? So, and then of course I can take that one step further and go, okay, well, you can't actually score runs in an enclosed environment. So cricket being, we often train in enclosed spaces where you can't tell whether or not it's worked. It's not like hitting a ball over net and seeing where it landed in the court and be like, yeah, that is a legit hit. We don't have that in so many training environments. So what if those runs don't count? Would coaches then go out onto the field and play modified games because they really want those runs to count towards the training championship? And so I was fully just running with this idea as much as possible to see, like, how many things could we change if we rewarded the behaviors that we get at training and for enjoying learning at training instead of performing on the weekend, which is, based on so many things that are out of our control. Regardless of how many modified rules and games we play, we still get people who try to cheat the system to win a competition that's not even points. Like, there is no finals, there's nothing, and people will still try to cheat the system. So what if we just make them train in a way that is competitive, in a good way, where they can compete to get better at what they do in more functional ways and improve it that way? So yeah, I think recreating those moments is really important. We can win those moments and still lose the game. Unfortunately, that's just, and that's kind of why we come back, right? Is that you never really know what's going to happen.
Have you read anything from John O'Sullivan before?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, he in his book, I think Every Moment Matters, he talks about how they adjusted pretty much asked that question, what else can we win? So I'm not sure if he did it or someone he was talking to did it. They, in a soccer game, every time they passed the ball, they would donate $1 to charity. So instead of parents getting angry that kids are passing the ball, they're just like, oh, well, we're winning because, charity's going crazy. So I guess that's the way they found that sort of incorporates that question, what else can we win? We can win learning more, and we can also win by donating money.
I had a really great example from Cam Trudell in cricket, who he pretty much did exactly that during the competition year. And especially with teams that maybe don't necessarily win because they're much smaller or not as skillful, they would reward behaviors like, okay, I'm not actually going to give you a run for running. I'm going to give a run to your partner if they call you to run too. So in real life, it would look like, okay, the batter's just hit the ball, it's running, they get to the other end, and their partner turns around and calls, oh, we can go again. And so that kid would then also get 2 runs or 2 points in the team championship. But the kid batting on strike would get 2 runs, like genuine scores within the competition. And it got to the point where the kids almost valued the team competition more than the actual performance competition. And so they would end up scoring ridiculous numbers of points. And it became so valuable to them that they actually stopped asking what the real score was, which I think is the most amazing story. So they're like, okay, today we scored 897 points. And how did we do that? Because this guy ran 3 singles. That is so much, that's 3 times more than he used to run. Or we did this many things well because we decided that that's valuable and we're now doing it out there. And of course, eventually they got to the point where they were so skillful that they were winning the competitions, but it didn't matter to them because they were more worried about how many points they were scoring in the team meeting after the game than what the genuine scoreboard said. And I thought, I would just love, there would be so many people in sport who never win a game but would still love sport if they got that level of satisfaction out of what they are capable of, not whether or not they can beat the next person. And I think we've missed that opportunity a lot lately.
I've got a bit of a following online now, and some of the feedback I get from sharing my philosophies around sport and sharing that, yeah, winning's one thing, but it's not everything. I think a lot of people see that as, well, that's like soft coaching, because I don't really do punishments. I don't do yelling, and I actually actively discourage it. And I think, personal opinion, I think we've been sort of conditioned into the idea that that's necessary. So when that doesn't happen, people sort of like, oh, that's not coaching. That's just you being friends. The thing I say is, yeah, like, I don't punish people and I don't yell at people, but I still have very high expectations of people. And I guess, how do we change the perception, especially in players, that there is more to sport than just winning? And I think it's become such a cliche these days. They're just like, oh, it's the friends we made along the way. But honestly, sort of true, because not every single person's going to become the top 0.1% of pro players. And I think it starts with the parents and it starts with the players' perceptions. Like, how do we start tackling that idea?
I mean, it's really coming in with the hard questions here at the moment.
Sorry, I should have preambled.
No, it's good, because I think it's a question where we really need the answer to. And I think it's very easy to blame people, but nobody's really moved the needle on this either. This idea about winning. So actually, I've been rewatching Ted Lasso. And for like the third or fourth time, because I really wanted to write about why it was such an important thing to watch in the first place. And I remember when the third season dropped, and a lot of people just didn't get it. And I thought that was so fascinating, because like after the first season, which was very much about the team and winning, etc., or losing more so than anything else, people could relate to that. And then we get to the second season, where it's more about like the integration of sports psychologists. And for someone who almost but decided not to become a sports psych, that was a very accurate representation of how uncomfortable coaches get when you invade their training environment. And as a skill act, even more so, because people see us as coaches. And I've often been told people are worried that I'm going to steal their job if I know enough about their sport to seem like I'm a coach too. And so the third season being about what is expected of a winning coach and what it takes to win, I find was lost on so many people, because they genuinely believe the exact same things that are happening in the show. And it just fed into their biases, and they couldn't see the satirical commentary that was happening underneath that, because it was just completely under their radar. And so now, like, I'm only a couple of episodes into season 3, but I can already see it, like this pressure to behave in a certain way, because you think that correlates with winning games. But as we know, very little correlates with anything in terms of sport. And that is why it's so hard to exist in this space, is that I can do something, but the effect of that on the rest of the system is almost unpredictable. Almost. There are definitely probable things that we can do. If I train really poorly, chances are I'll play pretty poorly. But what good training looks like could look very, very different. And so just this notion of like what you would expect coaches to do, I noticed recently that I was always comfortable with being like, no, I'm gonna do it this way, because I have something to fall back on. I've always had really strong theoretical roots that I could go back to and be like, this is why I believe this is the most appropriate way to tackle this question or to support these people. And at the very least, if I didn't have that, then I would always divert to those people first, the people I'm actually working with, compared to the people who think they know what they're talking about. And that's not something that I would expect other people to do, because I've always been quite strong in my beliefs, especially around people deserve to have positive experiences when moving their bodies. That is it. That is what support is supposed to be. It's supposed to be this exploration of what you think you are capable of and getting to a point where you can do more than you thought you could. That's why we endeavor to play competitions and compete against other people, because we need that to push ourselves beyond what we think we can do. And I think we've lost that along the way, because it's so easy to shortcut what learning looks like by intervening as a coach. So the reason why direct instruction works, the reason why telling someone what to do works, is because in that moment, they might be able to perform it, and we tick that off as learning. But learning and performing aren't the same thing. So along the way, I think we got to the point where if someone can do the thing straight away after I've told them to, great. They pay attention. They're coachable. I can work with this kind of person. But the person who doesn't respond well to that because it just does not suit what they need in that moment to unlock the next 1% of what they're capable of, coaches will then go and directly blame that athlete instead of themselves. And I found that the coaches that I can work with the most, the people that I can actually spend more time with and make more progress with, are the people when I ask who's at fault here for losing a game, losing a moment, etc., for not being able to solve that problem. And they blame the athletes. I can't deal with that person. As much as I would love to, we are too disparate in what we believe for me to have a conversation that's going to be able to help you as a coach, because I am of the belief that we need to recognize that our learning environments are the reason why athletes can't do something. Because I haven't exposed them to that moment. I haven't given them the opportunity to solve that problem. I haven't put them in a position where they feel like they've been here before. Even if I can never perfectly replicate it, I still want them to get there and think, oh, I could do this. Or if I can't do it, I'm going to try it and see what happens. If they don't feel that in that moment, I have failed as a coach. And I want to, and I can definitely work with those coaches more, because then we can reevaluate what their training environments look like and recreate those moments in a way that's really useful for the athlete. But the people who blame athletes for not being able to do something are the people that I really struggle to work with, because I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's our responsibility to help them through that moment.
So I guess your mission statement could revolve around coaching coaches to create learning environments for positive moving bodies? Question mark?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Positive experiences with movement.
Yeah.
Like, I think we get lost in the fact that like sport is only one component of what we're actually trying to achieve here, right? Like, yes, there is a sport that we're playing, but hopefully by the end of it, we don't want them to be so terrified of physical activity because they hate sport that they never engage with anything. And so even just getting to a point where, well, if I ask you, what are you trying to achieve? And I ask that over and over and over and over again, I would like to think that we all kind of get to the point where we're like, well, I want people to think that they're capable human beings and that they can do things that are incredibly skillful. And that applies to just about anything. It just so happens that this person is well suited to this sport. And I, as a coach, am also well suited to this sport. So together we can kind of get further along than we could alone. I don't think we remember that that's why sport exists in the first place.
Yeah.
Is to have an engagement with moving our bodies.
Yeah, gotcha. You think it's just taken way out of proportion of how important winning is, and that sport really is just for fun?
It was supposed to be an entertaining way to exercise. And as someone who is an exercise scientist, I think it genuinely needs to come back to that. And I've heard some horrible stories lately of people who are terrified of basketballs because they had one bad basketball coach and they can't go down to their local park and shoot hoops with their friends. Like, how dare you rob someone of that rich life experience because you were a terrible coach?
Yeah. Well, it happens more than you think. Like, I think initially we're like, oh, yeah, we always knew one cranky coach. But the amount of comments I get in saying, yeah, I've been picked up by the collar from my coach and yelled at, and just absolutely humiliated in front of everyone. Like, it amazes me. It just amazes me how often that happens.
I remember being 14 maybe, and I think that this is my coaching origin story, in that I was watching like the Inter cricket. I think it was maybe still Kanga cricket then, or Milo cricket. And it's often run by parent volunteers, and like any money that you get just kind of goes back into the program. It's not like you make money like in tennis where hot shots can be a business. And I watched a parent grab a kid's arm and just like extend it out to be like, you have to bowl with a straight arm, so you need to do this. And I was so offended, because in school we had just been learning about like personal and social responsibility. The fact that you were allowed to touch a kid just angered me so much. And I was like, how dare you get to a point where you have to grab a 6-year-old's arm and shove it into the air to prove your point? How bad of a coach are you if you have to physically move somebody else's body because you can't create the right activity or the right instructions to encourage them to do so? And I don't know how I made that connection immediately, but it stuck with me my entire coaching career so far. And in all of the research that I've gone, pretty much everything comes back to that moment. And I just think it's because we don't like the fact that we can't control other people. And so I can shortcut that by physically manhandling them. And you are not allowed to do that. But it's socially acceptable in a sporting context to do that, to get people to do what you want. And I'm so glad that we have more rigorous checks around working with children. But those people slip through the cracks all of the time. And there's no real way to address that issue because it is so deep-seated. It is not the issue of grabbing the kid's arm and moving it. It comes back to so much more around what is socially acceptable in those environments, what is good coaching, what I can get away with, how do people learn in the first place. Unless you can answer those questions, you shouldn't be allowed to coach. Because that is where the harm happens, the inability to answer those questions and know what your assumptions are. And you would not sit down and grab a child's hand if you believed that learning was a positive experience where you get to explore a moment.
Yeah, I think it just, it's hard because it really does come down to, at one point these parents were doing this because they were doing a favor for the club and the intentions are in the right place. Intentions are in the right place, and they just didn't have any training whatsoever in coaching or even connecting with other kids. So is that, now, even now when I'm coaching for my club, no professional development, is really just asking parents, hey, can you volunteer? Can you jump in? And that, I think that's the same in a lot of sports around the world. Soccer coaches, a lot of people have their parent for their coach. And it makes it really hard. So is just education the way forward? Is that it?
Yeah, I've been thinking more about ground rules. So what is the minimum amount of education that you should have before you're allowed to interact with young people? Because I think there are so many more research, stories, etc., that highlight the positive impact that sport can have and the ongoing negative impact that we can have if you have a bad experience in sport. And it's not just the child in front of you, right? So if you as a parent don't engage in sport, your likelihood of your child engaging in sport plummets. So all it takes is one bad person in your life in a sporting context to drive you away from that, and you could ruin generations of people engaging with physical activity through sport. So this idea that we can't do any harm if we're actually just, we're coming from good intentions is absolutely not true, because we can do generations of harm just from being ignorant. And so I was at the point where I genuinely believe that people are just doing their best. They have good intentions, etc. They just don't know better. Well, if they just don't know better, isn't it my job to help them know better? And so I think we almost need a minimum ground rules of what you need to know before you coach. And that doesn't have to be sport specific at all.
And what would that look like? Would that be like a checklist that worked with kids, get your blue card?
At the very minimum, yes. But also you have to engage with a learning opportunity before you start. You have to do some sort of education before you start. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be allowed to walk out there on a pitch with a whistle until you understand the consequences of blowing that whistle at the wrong time.
I guess now, things just turn into modules these days, So is that how you would recommend it? Or how, perfect world, what would it look like for you?
I think there should definitely be a minimum online module of working with children. So an introduction to coaching that's kind of generic. We recently, the Australian Sports Commission redid the essential skills. So things that every coach should be able to do regardless of their sporting context. It was first introduced around the Olympics when, getting good coaches was necessary to win more medals at the Olympics. But the essential skills guidelines hadn't been updated for 18, 19 years. So we've gotten to the point now where we have much, much better ones, and they're quite engaging, and it's literally free online. Anyone can do it. But I think the hardest part is the requirement of making people do it. So most organizations are do not want to mandate anything at all because we're very strapped for volunteers in general. And in doing so, we've left through a lot of people who are willing to volunteer, but are potentially causing harm in the way that they volunteer. And I'd rather have and it's a chicken and the egg issue now, because if they don't have volunteers and we don't have teams, so people can't participate, and then if we ask too much of the volunteers to train before they can coach, then they're going to not put their hand up in the first place, therefore no team. But if we do let them do it completely rogue without any oversight whatsoever, we know that those people are causing harm, and the statistics are there to prove it. We have kids dropping out of sport at 11 years old.
Yep.
You don't even know what your favorite flavor of ice cream is at 11 years old, and you're deciding that this sport is not for you because you've had that many negative experiences? How dare you steal someone's life like that? You owe them. You owe them years of life if you drive a kid out of sport. You should take it off your own life and put it on theirs. And so those ideas, it's really hard to get a straightforward response to that, because you don't really know what's going to work, but what we're doing now is not working. And in a really bad way. I'm all for participating teams having someone who is willing to put their hand up, but if that person then turns around within the first training session and yells at them, immediately no. And I think we need those ground rules and decide on what those ground rules are, so that we can actually say what is acceptable from those people and what isn't. And we currently don't have that.
Okay. Interesting. Let me write that down. Now, last question, because I know I've been just shooting questions your way this whole time. I loved it. Thank you so much. Often I think a lot of players can just feel like a cog in the system. What can players do? What can players sort of equip themselves with, or really do to try and find a better space? Because now with the access to internet, I think a lot of people are actually seeing other coaches coach. That's one of my missions, trying to show people, hey, you don't need to get yelled at by your coach. So now these players are seeing these other opportunities and other different ways of coaching. They may say, oh, my coach sort of sucks, I hate this. What can they do?
I think it's so hard, especially because it's not easy to leave a club or leave a space or enter a new one. And as someone who has played a lot of sport as an adult and has tried to experience different sports are not welcoming of people who didn't grow up in that sport. And if you don't know exactly what the social conventions are of when you can talk, what you do at a training session, etc., especially adults, the older you get, the harder it is to play sport. In particular, sports that have a rich cultural history. And so I think for athletes, it's finding those moments within the training session where you can almost try and regulate yourself where possible, and those reminders around what is learning and what is performance. So trying to, I know there's a quite a big performance emphasis a lot on whether or not we can do something right now, but I really love the idea of, is that closer or further away from where I want it to be? And I can ask myself that over and over again and readjust. But the second someone else asks me that at the wrong time, the magic's gone. If someone gives me feedback about something that I'm already working through, they're like, wow, you really need to do this. I'm like, no. I've already thought of that. Give me a second. I will work it out. Give me a couple more opportunities to try. People don't like that, as it turns out. Especially when you're new in a sport. I tried to transfer from cricket to baseball, and I told them I wouldn't hit the ball off the tee, and they were like, how dare you? It's like, well, I can show you all the research to show me that it's not going to help me at all. But at the same time, I don't want to. Can just throw me the ball. Again, people don't respond well. So I think finding those moments within your own practice where it's like, okay, I can regulate how I use this information and what I want to do with it. What am I going to keep, and what is going to make me better at what I do, and what do I just need to wash over me? And it's a lot to ask, especially of young people. You shouldn't have to do that, but we're at a stage now with our coaching and our unregulation of coaching, that means that we kind of need to look after ourselves in those moments. And I've definitely just put on a persona at training sometimes just to get through a session because I completely disagreed with the way the session was going. But I tried to learn as much as I could from it and keep the valuable pieces locked away so I can use them when they matter to me, and then kind of just let the rest happen.
Well, I hope young players don't have to endure it for long. And I also hope that they can take on what you just said of being able to accept what they want to and not accept what they don't want to, really. But cool. Okay. Now, Alex, I'm going to finish this podcast by asking you one last question. And that question is, as a doctor, what's your hottest take? Hot take time.
I mean, are we going to do the radical one or are we going to just do the normal one?
You do whatever you think is appropriate for what you want to share on this platform.
I think a hot take is intentionality outweighs most things. So when we behave with intention, it completely shifts the way we do things. And when was the last time that you actually set a really clear intention for what you were doing? For me, I kind of try to do it within every moment or every day where I'm trying to do something. And it doesn't really take more than a couple minutes to ask yourself that question, like, what is the intention here? And so a lot of the issues that we've spoken about or the concepts that we've covered come back to, like, did I have a clear intention for this particular moment? And we might like to think that coach development, education, etc. is quite complex. And it is, but it doesn't have to be complicated. And I think a simple question like that, like, it doesn't have to be hard. It just has to be intentional. And that can completely change the trajectory of what you do and how you do it as a coach. So, intentionality outweighs a lot of things.
Dr. Alex Lascu, thank you so much for joining the very first episode of What Needs to Change with Coach Artie. I appreciate your work.